This is the My Dark Path podcast. I have a lifelong love for Japan and a lifelong fascination with this country. From the outside, the world sees a small island nation that's both progressive and ancient, with a captivating history and culture that traces back thousands of years, while it being a modern leader in technology and entertainment. Every country has its own community filled with passionate fans of Japanese culture. They refer to themselves as otakus, and they consume Japanese manga, anime, films, and television shows with ecstatic enthusiasm. Japan is the birthplace of cosplay, where fans are inspired to dress up as fantastical characters from their favorite stories, while leading designers and celebrities around the world have taken inspiration from the eclectic fashions of Tokyo's Harajuku neighborhood. And as one of the pioneers in video gaming, they helped turn little electronic amusements into an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But to really understand Japan from the inside, you need to understand fire, because this island nation was literally born from it. In Japanese mythology, the god Izanagi and his consort Izanami created the islands of Japan by dipping a spear into the ocean from atop the Rainbow Bridge of Heaven. The drops of water which fell from the tip of the spear became the nation we know today. Izanagi and Izanami then had many children who became ancient gods and goddesses. But it was the fire god, born last, who killed Izanami by his birth. Izanagi attempted to retrieve his love from the underworld, but her body had decayed too much, and she was forever lost to him. Remember this legend of lost love as we dig into today's story. As with many ancient myths, there's an uncanny connection to the truth. Japan sits precariously on a rift in the ocean floor that goes down 5 miles. It's known as the Tuscarora Deep, and it means that this nation is one of the most seismically active places on Earth. It's part of what's known as the Ring of Fire, the greatest concentration of volcanoes anywhere on the planet. Its land is almost all mountainous. Only 17% of it can actually be farmed. As with the Hawaiian Islands, cooled lava defines the terrain. And the famous Mount Fuji is just one of the many volcanoes which are considered active. In many of Japan's greatest cities, there's a mist in the atmosphere that makes the air and light different from anywhere else I've been. This mist is the steam from those volcanoes. There are also earthquakes and tsunamis which have toppled cities and cost countless lives throughout the history of Japan. Their modern skyscrapers are among the most resilient buildings on Earth, able to withstand devastating tremors. But in traditional Japanese construction, the primary materials for any home were wood and paper. Fire is both the origin of Japan and its greatest fear, the symbol of nature's greatest power and the fragility of our mortal lives. We touched on this in our episode about Japan's attempt to start forest fires in America during World War II with the Fugo balloons. Memories of the devastation wrought by fire are passed down and reinforced generation after generation with the Japanese people. So you might easily understand why one of the worst crimes in Japanese society is arson. The ability of one small fire to grow into an all-consuming cataclysm means that anyone playing recklessly with fire faces severe punishment. Which brings us to today's story about a real-life fire which grew into a legend that helps us understand Japan better than any statistic. The fire was an act of arson, and the person who started it was a grocer's daughter named Aoya Oshiichi. For her crime, she was executed at the age of just 16. But what made the story of Aoya Oshiichi live on is not what she did, but why. The fire she started, which spread great destruction and brought about her death, she started for love. Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and welcome to Season 2 of the My Dark Path podcast. In every episode, we explore the fringes of history, science, and the paranormal. So if you geek out over these subjects, you're among friends here at My Dark Path. We hope you'll check us out on Instagram, sign up for our newsletter at mydarkpath.com, or just send an email to me at explore@mydarkpath.com. And as of this week, we've just launched our second YouTube episode. We finally figured out how to develop the high-quality programming that we can be proud of, and we expect to launch episodes on a regular basis. So check us out at My Dark Path on YouTube. And now in 2022, we're also launching our Patreon, where subscribers will have access to unique, exclusive episodes, starting with our special mini-series, a My Dark Path tour called Secrets of the Soviets, looking at the history, science, and paranormal in Cold War Moscow. Finally, thanks for listening and choosing to walk the dark paths of the world with me. Let's get started with episode 29, The Fire Maiden in Love. Part 1. In the 6th century, Buddhism, as it was evolving in China, started to migrate through Korea and then eventually reached Japan. The Japanese emperor permitted Buddhist practices in a limited way at first, but eventually saw it as harmless. The native Japanese already had their own spiritual system known as Shintoism. Practitioners of Shinto worship kami, godly spirits which surround us everywhere. There are kami in winds, in storms, in roads, on the shoreline, and it's kami who create waterfalls and usher in the autumn. Their world is hidden to us, but the beauty and power of nature are their work and deserve our respect and gratitude. Meanwhile, Buddhism teaches that this world is an illusion and that our bodies are vessels for an immortal spirit that will be reborn here until it transcends earthly desires and appetites and moves on to the spirit world. You can see how these two religions resonate with one another and how they've evolved into an inseparable form unique to Japan. The virtues of Japanese culture are wisdom, patience, and excellence in all things. Everyday activities can be elevated to deeds of religious significance. It's how Japanese calligraphy can be worthy of a museum, how the simple preparation and drinking of tea can become a beautiful and reverent ceremony, how the act of arranging flowers is treated as a high art form known as ikebana. To be cultured in Japan, educated in literature and the classics, to have the discipline and humility to invest so much of yourself in these everyday activities makes you worthy of the highest esteem. If you see a Japanese, Korean, or Chinese word which ends in do, such as judo or aikido, that do has a dual meaning. Roughly translated, it can mean both to talk about as well as the road or the way. So a do can be both a philosophy and a path, and for Buddhists, it's a path to enlightenment. It's important to note that in the Japanese practice of Buddhism, the bodies of the dead are cremated, a ritual which completes the destruction of their temporary vessel and sets their spirit free into the universe to either return again or stay in the world of the kami. Here again, we see the inevitability of fire in the collective consciousness of the Japanese. Now, in 1923, an earthquake struck Tokyo, which sounds like something out of an apocalyptic movie. Cracks opened up in the ground, which were so large and deep that people fell to their deaths. Uncontrollable blazes ravaged the paper and wood homes across the city, leaving almost 2 million residents homeless. And when the chaos finally settled, more than 140,000 people were either dead or missing. Much like the horrific fires in the American cities of Chicago and San Francisco that wiped out many of their original buildings, this disaster in Tokyo led the Japanese people to rebuild their city with modern ideas and materials in concrete and steel instead of wood. And what started there was only accelerated by the massive and devastating campaign of firebombing by America during World War II. Other major cities in the country followed Tokyo's lead, and while traditional buildings are still everywhere as a part of its culture and history, The look of the modern Japanese skyline is forever linked to the memory of those blazes. And one of the most terrible contemporary disasters in Japan also carries that element of fire. In March of 2011, an earthquake and the tsunami it produced led directly to the meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear plant. The plant's fail-safe system shut down the 3 active reactors, which is just what they were designed to do. But the loss of power shorted out the plant's cooling system, and without it, nuclear residue couldn't be flushed out of those reactors. The fuel rods inside began to liquefy, dripping into the containing vessels and melting giant holes. The nuclear material leaked out through these holes, and the hydrogen in the outer containment buildings heated up until the pressure was unsustainable, causing explosions. Plant workers rushed into the disaster in an attempt to stabilize the reactors, knowing full well they were exposing themselves to a fatal dose of radiation. How they managed to do such complex technical work in the face of this kind of terror fills me with awe. This was a meltdown on the scale of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, which is an episode we'll cover in The Secrets of the Soviets. But for the Japanese, it also brought up memories of the years of sickness and death that followed in the aftermath of the 2 atomic bombs that America dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to finish World War II. The local government evacuated the area immediately around Fukushima, then created a quarantine zone of 30 kilometers, requiring all residents to stay inside. Eventually, over 150,000 Japanese citizens had to be evacuated. The meltdown continued for months, with fires and radiation leaks always on the brink of breaking out. Over 10 years after the disaster, many residents still have not been able to move back to their homes. The managers of the plant are the Tokyo Electric and Power Company, also known as TEPCO, and they've been sued for the suicides related to the disaster. In one striking case, a woman named Hamako Watanabe, a resident of a town near the plant, was forced to move from her home. She and her husband lost their jobs, and the twin prospects of unemployment and homelessness crippled her mental health. She doused herself in kerosene and lit herself on fire. The court case was the first to hold TEPCO directly responsible for the damages to an individual. The tragedy of death by suicide ties deeply into many Eastern cultures. In Japan, it was part of the samurai code to be willing to lay down one's life for one's lord. It was even considered that ritual suicide was the way to recover your honor after a shameful failure. The so-called kamikaze pilots of World War II knowingly threw away their lives to inflict damage on American warships. To this day, the country has the 7th highest suicide rate in the world. 70% of the victims of suicide are men, and it's the leading cause of death for Japanese men aged 20 to 44. News reports regularly feature accounts of people throwing themselves in front of trains to end their lives. There's a strong belief in Japan that all things are transitory and that this life is just a brief chapter in the story of our immortal spirit. In this way, among others, despite meaningful differences between religions worldwide, there is a surprising commonality among them: the idea that this mortal existence is just a short phase in the immortality of our spirits. But back to Japanese culture. For all the emphasis on dutifulness and excellence in service, there's a downside that any failure or disappointment feels catastrophic and unforgivable. Now, there's no rational analysis in which Hamako Watanabe's losses were her own fault, but that wasn't enough to save her. Part 2. To find our way into the story of Aoya Oshiichi, we have to talk about the Tokugawa shogunate. We went into some detail about this transformative period in Japanese history in our Season 1 finale, about the so-called Tomb of Jesus in northern Japan. After over 80 years of war between Japan's many rival states, the nation was finally unified under the rule of the shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu. It was effectively a military dictatorship, with the samurai acting as the honored knights enforcing their master's rule. It saw Japan isolating itself from the world, purging the country of missionaries and diplomats. They created an offshore port so that any foreigners they did business with would never set foot on Japanese soil. There are a lot of similarities of this to the feudal system in Europe, where a network of lords owned and ruled the land, with subordinate lords holding local titles. In order to live on the land, tenants performed all the labor of farming and harvesting, providing goods and food, and paying taxes and tributes to the owners. As the enforcers, the samurai pledged their loyalties until their deaths. A samurai without a master was considered an outcast, cut loose from purpose and prosperity, and they were known as ronin. In one sense, it was a time of prosperity and peace with no threats from the outside, and the few significant rebellions were quashed quickly and ruthlessly. The nobles in the good graces of the shogun and his successors became very wealthy indeed. With abundant leisure time, art and literature flourished among the nobility, producing a cultural golden age of painting, poetry, calligraphy, and more. But seen from another angle, Japan under the 2 centuries of the shogunate was an unyielding police state, with severe punishments meted out to those who broke the law. Samurai had the legal right to kill any Japanese citizen. This privilege was known as kirasute, and a samurai faced no consequences for any death they deemed necessary. You could die for a crime as small as not making way and prostrating yourself on the ground when the daimyo, the local lord, paraded through town. And in a country where fire represented the greatest nightmare in their shared cultural memory, the penalty for arson was also death. This was the crime that our subject of today, Aoya Oshichi, died for. Under Tokugawa, the city of Edo became the effective capital of Japan. Today, we know it as Tokyo, and this is where Aoya Oshichi was born, in the neighborhood of Hongo in the year 1666. Remember that year for later. Her father was a greengrocer in Hongo, well respected in the community. The closest we have to verifiable history is this. There was a massive fire in her family's temple, Shosenin, and a temple page or worker named Ikuta Shonosuke came to fight the fire. And this was their first meeting, and they fell in love. And whatever happened next, it was so hard for the infatuated teenager to meet again with her love that she felt she was forced to light a second fire on purpose, believing it would bring him back to her. At the time, Japan would not execute anyone under the age of 16, but Oshiichi was 16, and there are indications that the local magistrate gave her repeated opportunities to say instead that she was only 15 and therefore be spared the death penalty. But Oshiichi refused to lie, and so the magistrate fulfilled the duties of his office and sentenced her to die. The method would both be ironic and horrifying. She would be burned at the stake. Again, the parallels to medieval Europe are startling. Joan of Arc, for example, was burned at the stake for heresy. Japan, under Tokugawa, had plenty of experience with the technique, and they had already burned more than 700 suspected Christians. We know now that nearly all victims of this cruelty die of smoke inhalation before they burn, but in the end, their life is just as gone. A 17th century writer named Ihara Saikaku recounted the story of Aoya Oshiichi in a work titled 5 Women Who Loved Love. This is the beginning of a process by which these brief, sad facts of a tragedy brought about by a teenage infatuation became an influential folk story in Japanese culture. One reason may be due to a powerful detail that Saikaku included that, true or not, only added to the symbolic power of the tale. Oshiichi, the author claims, held a cherry blossom in her hand as she died. In Japan, there is no more potent and universal a symbol of the fragility of life as the sakura, the cherry blossom. The delicate and tiny blossoms only last for a brief season each year, and the entire country of Japan throws a festival centered around it. During cherry blossom season, Thousands of employees in Tokyo and other major cities will devote their lunch breaks to looking at the precious flowers. Every popular business chain gets in on the celebration with seasonal bento boxes, cherry blossom mochi donuts, and even cherry blossom sake. As you can imagine, it's a floral, slightly sweet flavor, subtler than the aggressive cherry syrups Americans get in their desserts. A personal favorite are the sweets made by the venerable candy-making institution Minamoto Kichoen. They look like little clouds made from red and white azuki beans, colored pink on the outside and crowned with a dried sakura. In Tokugawa's time, the samurai embraced the cherry blossom as a symbol of their own lives, which could be cut short on any given day. But by adding to the tableau of Aoya Oshiichi's execution, it gives the 16-year-old girl facing death for the reckless deed she did for love a stoicism which is larger than life. It implies that she's facing this tragic tale with acceptance, even a sense of honor. None of us could really know what she was feeling as the flames caught below her, but this is the power of storytelling. One extra little detail about the fragility of life, and we have an enduring legend about love. Let's take a look at this version of the story in a little more detail, since it lays a lot of groundwork for the interpretations and reimaginings that followed. Aihara Saikaku titled his version, The Greengrocer's Daughter with a Bundle of Love. It opens with preparations for the new year in the neighborhood of Hongo, merchants peddling firewood, sandals, socks, seafood, toys, arrows, and roasted nuts, while children play in the street around them. And suddenly, a great fire breaks out and quickly engulfs the entire block. People grab whatever belongings they can and scramble for safety. Aoya Oshiichi is with her mother, and together they and many others flee to the family's temple. This is how Saikaku describes the young woman, quote, as beautiful as the blossoms of Ueno, as delicately radiant as the moon shining on Sumidogawa, and the woman of almost every man's desire, end quote. In the temple, there is chaos, bodies packed in so tightly that people must step over one another or even sleep on top of one another. And even worse, after the fire, a terrible storm strikes, and those who've been driven out of their homes must temporarily depend on aid from the temple monks for survival. A refugee gives Oishi a gift, a fine black silk kimono with a red lining. The young woman ponders this gift, how useless it is in the midst of the current crisis, and what this means about the fleeting nature of life. She says, quote, life is a dream in which nothing has value, and only the awakening, the life hereafter, is real, end quote. This is one of those moments where a myth or folk tale makes a connection with its audience by reflecting the values of their own culture. In this version of the story, Oshiichi is already espousing the core beliefs of Japanese Buddhism, already seeing life the way her nation sees the cherry blossom. In the midst of a prayer, Oshiichi discovers a young man struggling to remove a splinter from his hand. It would not be considered modest for a young woman to volunteer to help, but Oshiichi's mother asks her to do it, which makes it all the more proper. The author gives the young man the name of Kishiaburo, a change from his real name of Shonosuke. He also gets a change of job. Instead of being a temple page, as he was in real life, he's an apprentice samurai, someone for whom honor would be foremost in his mind. Nevertheless, Kishiaburo and Aoya Oshiichi fall passionately in love at that first meeting. As the crisis passes, they are separated, but then they begin to secretly exchange letters brimming with the sentiments of young love. With each exchange, their desperation to see one another again grows stronger. After the new year, there's another storm. The author describes the women in this world as easily panicked, and as the storm intensifies, Oshiichi's mother tells her to hide under blankets and to cover her ears from the thunder. But Oshiichi, fueled by her determination to see her love once again, proclaims, quote, I was ready to die in the fire, and I am not going to fear for my life now, end quote. Again, the author creates both foreshadowing and a sense of destiny. The temple cook reveals to Oshiichi where her love sleeps. He shares a room with another novice samurai, but when she unties her hair and sash, the roommate is powerless to stop her from entering. Still, he wants to yell out and ask what is she doing until she offers him any bribe he wishes to keep quiet. He asks for cash, playing cards, and candy. Oshiichi promises to deliver them, and with that, the path is clear for her to be with Kishiaburo. He's sleeping, but she lays beside him and he stirs awake to see her. They each confess that they are not yet even 16 years old, but they make love nonetheless. They can only hope that the sounds don't reach through the thin walls to the boy's superiors. At dawn, a bell rings and the lovers must part. It reminds me of the morning after Romeo and Juliet marry in Shakespeare's play, where they joke about whether or not the sun has really come out, because they want to prolong this moment together. Oshiichi's mother, though, has noticed that her daughter was missing in the night and becomes determined to keep her away from the boy. Meanwhile, Kishiaburo's roommate continues to threaten to expose the couple if Oichi is not able to come up with the bribe he demanded. Again, the lovers are forced to communicate only in letters delivered by a temple maid. One day, a country peddler comes to Oishi's home bearing baskets full of truffles and horsetails. Oshiichi buys them from him to give to her mother. Then the peddler laments that he does not want to make the long walk home in the snow, so Oshiichi's father permits him to spend the night in the courtyard. But soon the damp ground and freezing wind make the peddler ill. Oshiichi sees his suffering and asks her maid to bring the young man hot water. Then her mother shuts her away in the room for the night. But the family is distracted by Oshiichi's cousin giving birth to a baby, and when Oshiichi goes to the peddler and feels his garments, she realizes he's wearing the same silk undergarments she felt on her lover. The peddler is really Kishiaburo in disguise. She smuggles her young lover into a spare room, giving him medicine and warming him up. It's too risky for them to even make a sound, so they communicate in written notes, as they did when they were apart. And then they make love again. After this second encounter, it gets more difficult for both of them to slip away and see one another. Oshiichi is desperate to see her lover again. She recalls how it was a disaster which brought them together, and this is when she decides to light a fire for the chance that it might bring Kishiaburo back to her again. She is caught quickly and confesses willingness to the crime of arson. She is sentenced to die, and as she crosses a bridge to the place of execution, witnesses feel pity for her, while knowing that she must be punished for the wrong she did. Saikaku, the author, adds that the young woman displays no sense of guilt, and that, even when facing death, she is lovely to behold. A supporter hands her a cherry blossom. As her final moments approach, she declares, quote, "It is all a dream, an illusion," end quote. She prays to Amida Buddha to save her soul and sings, quote, "How sad a world it is when I must fall today like the last blossoms of a cherry and leave my ill fame to blow about in the winds of spring," end quote. And then, as in real life, she is burned at the stake. The execution happens at dawn, and Saikaku describes Oshiichi joining, quote, "the wisps of smoke that hovered in the morning air," end quote. I have never imagined death by fire described so poetically. After Oichi's death, travelers passing through Hongo hear her story and leave offerings at her grave. Others plant anise, a plant whose sweet seeds add a licorice-like flavor to candies and liquors all over the world. Kishiaburo somehow isn't aware of her arrest and execution, and when he finally hears, he becomes obsessed with taking his own life, and it seems to be what everyone expects he will do. But there's a final twist. On the advice of his benefactor and the monks of the temple, he leaves behind his samurai studies and becomes a Buddhist monk himself. He proclaims that Oshiichi made him a slave to her desires, and that by pursuing the path of transcendence, in the next world their love will not die. Interestingly, Oshiichi's parents claim that this is the path their daughter would have wanted him to follow. In conclusion, the author writes, quote, "Death, the smoke of life, lies waiting at the end of every road. Nothing is so certain, nothing so sad," end quote. I can't help but draw a connection between the imagery of smoke and the Buddhist idea of life being an illusion, ephemeral and temporary. Part 3. I'm certainly going to remember the story as Saikaku tells it. It's a wonderful folk tale, marrying passion and symbolism, tragedy and thematic resonance. But it's crucial to remember that a lot of the details aren't verified by history, and many of them, particularly related to Oshichi's state of mind, would have simply been impossible for the author to know. In the hands of the author, she becomes a kind of martyr for love, bravely sacrificing her body on a journey to a place where her romantic wishes can finally be fulfilled. Did a real 16-year-old facing real flames have such transcendent thoughts? Probably not. And this is where the door opens to this true incident, planting a seed which would blossom in the imaginations of many more storytellers in the years to come. 20 years after Oshiichi's death, a playwright named Ki no Kaion wrote a bunraku play, a beautiful, highly stylized form of puppetry, based on the girl's life, romance, and death by fire. Decades later, this play inspired a trio of fellow playwrights, Suga Sensuke, Matsusa Kichi, and Watake Fume, to write a kabuki play called Date Musume Koi no Higanoko. That translates to The Valiant Maiden and the Fire-Red Fabric of Love. One huge difference up front. In these versions of the story, Yaoya Oshichi doesn't light a fire. Instead, she breaks a curfew, climbs a fire tower on a snowy night, and rings the fire bell in order to save her lover. She's sentenced to death for the false alarm, not for the arson. In this version, she hesitates repeatedly before climbing the fire tower. She even considers taking her own life with the sword rather than go through with the dishonorable deed she's pondering. But she does climb, and as in the other version of the story, she faces her execution honestly and fearlessly. This interests me because it changes the nature of Oshiichi as a character. She's not reckless and impulsive, endangering others because of a foolish idea that fire will bring her lover to her. She's willingly breaking the law to save his life. As far as we know from history, she really did start the fire, but you can see already the different writers in Japanese culture want to explore the intersection that this story sits at between love, the law, the nature of life, and the role of women. As you can imagine, in the rigid and militant culture of the Shokugawa shogunate, women were expected to be virtuous, graceful, and above all else, obedient. The ideal Japanese woman was referred to as the Yamato Nadeshiko, a delicate pink wildflower. A Yamato Nadeshiko embodies what they considered the feminine virtues, patience and charity. In the version of Yaoya Oshiiki's story written by Saikaku, the key moment is when she brings hot water to the freezing peddler who is secretly Kishiaburo in disguise. And yet, at their first encounter when he has a splinter in his hand, she does not move to touch him without first getting her mother's permission. So, at least at first, she has charity but also modesty. And seen through this lens, maybe the story is a cautionary tale like Red Riding Hood, warning young women of the dangers ahead if they are not properly modest and obedient. Loving Kishiaburo is not what leads to her death. It is the immodesty with which she pursues him that sets that final chain of events into motion. Not to mention her disobedience to her parents, another no-no for anyone aspiring to the ideal of the pink wildflower. We've talked about the combination of Shinto and Buddhism, inseparable from Japanese culture and history. But in the upper echelons of the shogunate, there was another strong influence on the way they ruled the nation, Confucianism. This is an ideology evolved from the teachings of the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius. It's much more humanistic than the leading Japanese systems, concerning itself with social order, ethical ways of governing, and the structure of the family and the community. At first, this would seem incompatible with Japanese concerns, but it seems to have filled a missing gap in the otherworldly beliefs of the dominant religion. After all, while people were pursuing their ascent into immortality among the spirits, They also needed guidelines for getting along with each other in more everyday circumstances. Confucianism was a system for finding a person's role in society, but it also held the belief that all social disorder and catastrophe stemmed from when people strayed from their proper role. The shogunate used many Confucian concepts for the basis of law and enforced such laws, let's say fiercely for some and not so fiercely for others. Women were expected to be chaste before marriage and unfailingly loyal after. For them, the price of adultery was death, but no man needed to fear the law for keeping a mistress or patronizing a brothel. Again, we see parallels with Europe, as two of King Henry VIII's wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were condemned to death for adultery, a crime which was practically his full-time occupation. We often zoom too far out and hope to see the progress of women and minorities in society as a steady march upward. But history is far more complex, and this is especially true in Japan. During the 2nd through 8th centuries, a number of Japan's supreme rulers were women, and women had the right to own and inherit property up through 1338. And for most of this era, women were expected to be well educated, with a particular emphasis on the literary arts. In fact, what's considered one of history's first novels, The Tale of the Genji, was written in early 11th century by noblewoman Murasaki Shibiku. But the Tokugawa shogunate represented a severe backlash toward this kind of equality. The rights of women were reduced, and the law was used as an instrument to restrict their behavior and freedom, and they were expected to receive only the most basic education. Their primary role in society was to get married and produce male offspring for their husband. They had the right to divorce her if this didn't happen. He also had the right to divorce her by simply claiming that he considered her lazy or that she talked too much. But women had no such right to leave a marriage. As the daughter of a merchant, Aoya Oshiichi would have had a good dowry to place to support herself and her future husband. Her life at that time presented her essentially 3 options: marry and be a dutiful spouse, become a Buddhist nun devoted to a life of chastity and self-denial, or turn to prostitution. Her life story, however brief, shows a passionate, violent rebellion against a society which gave her so little freedom. In mythical storytelling, there's a common phrase, the tragic flaw, the element in someone's nature that predicts their doom, even if they are a perfect hero of their culture's values in every other respect. A sense of romance, even adolescent romance, proves to be Oichi's tragic flaw. To this day, her legend is still a large part of Japanese culture. In 2014, the NHK network created a television miniseries based on her life. It was called Asaki Yumemishi Yaoya Oshichi Ibun. And in this version of the story, Oshiichi is sent to the temple after the fire to await the rebuilding of her home and family store. This is where she meets her love, who, in this version of the story, is named Kichisha. He's no longer an apprentice samurai, though. He's back to being a temple page as the real-life Shonosuke was. In the miniseries, there's a rival for Oshiichi's love, a man named Tadai, who works for her father. Her father wants her to marry Tadai, but this only deepens her rebellion and her passion for Kichisha. Once again, the parallels abound with Romeo and Juliet. Juliet's parents also had a husband picked out for their teenage daughter. Oshiichi even appears as an enemy character in a video game, part of the Megami Tensei series. But in this game, she isn't a tragic lover or an exemplar of Japanese beauty and virtue. She's a demon in the shape of a harpy with flaming wings, and even has the power to drive her enemies into a frenzy. It's a more bombastic version of the lament Kishiaburo makes in that first novel, that it was her willfulness and seduction which compelled him to betray his honor. As we've seen in so many cases in this podcast, the story being told often reveals more about the storyteller than the history from which they draw. Part 4. So even as Japan entered the modern age, there were significant backslides, especially in World War II. Any progress toward full rights for women, including the right to vote, came to a halt. Women were once again expected to be obedient to and in the service of the men who were fighting and dying for the emperor. And interestingly, women on the home front were often assigned the role of fire marshals. And despite the old image of the delicate wildflower, Japanese women in World War II got their hands as dirty as Rosie the Riveter did in America. They dug trenches, led search and rescue missions for bombing victims. They worked shifts of up to 20 hours a day in aircraft factories. They were preparing to serve as soldiers if the Allies invaded the Japanese mainland, all while being expected to keep their families together and raise children. And after the war, with so many young men of their generation dead, it was on Japan's women that the burden of rebuilding their nation fell. A great deal of progress has been made since then. Women in Japan have achieved the rights and equality they deserve in modern civilization. But as modern Japan struggles with decreasing marriage and plummeting fertility rates, of higher costs of living and children forced to live longer with their families, there remains immense cultural pressure on women. It's common belief that women over 25 are too old for marriage, and the slang term for them is expired Christmas cake. And we've certainly seen versions of this belief in America's past. The history of Japan is one of mingling influences, of a country creating its own versions of Chinese religions and philosophies, which complemented their existing beliefs. And it's in those open and inquisitive times that the nation seemed to make its greatest cultural progress. Yet, through all these phases of history, core elements endure: the awesome and terrifying power of fire, the code of honor which is held more valuable than our own mortal lives, and the captivating but fleeting beauty of the cherry blossom. There's another constant in Japanese society which we haven't discussed, but which ties into the power of Oshiichi's story. The Japanese calendar is partially inspired by the Chinese zodiac, which consists of 5 elements and 12 animals, creating a cycle of 60 years. Yaoya Oshiichi, it's believed, was born in the year 1666, and on the Japanese calendar, this is known as the Hunue Uma, the year of the fire horse. To this day, fewer children are born in fire horse years than in the years before or after. It's considered an omen of a life of violence and misfortune, especially if you're a woman. In the early 20th century, a young woman named Sada Abe failed at becoming a geisha, a uniquely Japanese combination of artistic performer and ceremonial host. Turning to prostitution, she contracted syphilis. She became the mistress of a married restaurant owner named Kishido Ishida, and there are outlandish stories of their sake-fueled sexual marathons. But when Ishida returned to his wife, Sada Abe became enraged and jealous. Inspired by a geisha play in which a scorned woman threatens her lover with a knife, she sold some of her clothing to buy a knife of her own. But rather than reacting with fear, Ishida found her jealousy to be highly arousing, and the two drank heavily and went to bed. And this is where Sada Abe subjected him to erotic asphyxiation, cut off his genitals, and hid them in a magazine cover to take with her. She fled to an inn in Shinagawa with a plan to leap to her death off Mount Ikoma, still holding the severed organs of her lover. But she was arrested before she could complete her plan. She was convicted of second-degree murder and mutilation of a corpse, and served 5 years in prison. And as her story became a nationwide sensation, inspiring lurid film adaptations, the story went that this was to be expected, as she was born in the year of the fire horse. Now that detail isn't true, by the way. The year of the fire horse is 1906, and Sada Abe was proven to be born in 1905. But the connotation of that year, the connection with the legend of Yaoya Oshiichi, could be so readily applied to this sensational crime, shows that it still resonates powerfully when applied to stories of forbidden love and a woman's role in Japanese culture. There's even a modern organization, the Hinoi Uma Association, founded by a group of 6 women who were all born in Japan in 1966, the most recent year of the fire horse. The superstition is still so prevalent that this organization dedicates itself to dispelling the legend. In a way, it's another fight for freedom. Freedom not just from their gender, but freedom from the time when they were born. If she had been born in a time of true freedom, who knows what kind of life a Yaoya Oshiichi might have lived. Maybe it would have been a very long and a very ordinary one we wouldn't still be talking about today. But instead, she was born on a dark path that started long before her and still runs through her nation today. I think that many folk tales and myths are set a long time ago for a reason, because the setting creates an instant comparison with ours. Either it was a more enlightened, fantastical time, or it was like the Tokugawa shogunate, violent and repressive. It's the violence of a rebellion that stands out, plus its ultimate cost. And maybe in the fictional version of her that sees beyond her death, that faces the flames with total courage and Sakura tucked in her arm, we find some solace and inspiration as we continue looking for those same things in our lives: freedom, transcendence, and love. Ultimately, what we remember is not the fire she started or the fire which killed her, but the fire she carried inside. Thank you for listening to My Dark Path. I'm MF Thomas, the creator and host. I produced this show with Courtney and Eli Butler, who just joined our team last week. Our creative director is Dom Purdy. This story was prepared for us by Anna Sahlstrom. It's her first with our team, and thank you, Anna. Welcome aboard. Our senior story editor is Nicholas Thurkettle, and our fact checker is Nicholas Abraham. Thank you to this group and the entire My Dark Path team. Please take a moment to give My Dark Path a rating and review wherever you're listening. And if you're on YouTube, please be sure to click over and watch our new full video YouTube episodes. Again, thanks for walking the dark paths of history, science, and the paranormal with me. Until next time, good night.